Across the Albanian landscape, from the sun-drenched Mediterranean coast to the remote mountain passes, a gray fever remains. It is a landscape defined by concrete, hundreds of thousands of bunkers that stand as silent monuments to a war that was never fought. Along the beaches, in the middle of farm fields, in people's backyards, scattered through forests, even wedged between gravestones, hundreds of thousands of concrete bunkers rise out of the ground. These squat, gray, indestructible domes sit half buried in the grass like monolithic scars across the earth. The numbers barely make sense. In a country you could drive across in a day, more than 700,000 of these bunkers were built, one for every 4 citizens. Not for a world war, for an invasion that existed only in one man's head. An attack that never came, not once, not in 4 decades. This wasn't just a military miscalculation. Poured into every one of these bunkers is the paranoia of a single mind, a mind that turned its own country into the darkest, most sealed-off place on the planet. A European nation that, for a stretch of the Cold War, was harder to enter than North Korea. This is the story of Enver Hoxha, a dictator who severed ties with every major power on Earth, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually China, too, until nothing was left but isolation. A man who banned religion outright, wrote its abolition into the Constitution, built one of the most feared secret police forces in Europe, and held 3 million people hostage inside a prison with no roof for more than 40 years. In this documentary, we go behind the locked doors and the concrete bunkers of a country that spent half a century running the strangest social experiment of the 20th century. History is in the headlines, but the truth? That's hidden in the profiles. Welcome to Profiles. Subscribe to join our community of curious minds. Unlike so many communist dictators who rose out of factory floors or peasant fields, Hoxha was an anomaly among his peers, an educated, middle-class intellectual in a movement that glorified the proletariat. He was born in 1908 into a reasonably comfortable Muslim family in Albania. His youth unfolded not in factories, but in the cafes and lecture halls of Europe. In the 1930s, a government scholarship sent him to France. He was sharp-dressed, quick with words, and far more interested in the radical circles and communist ideas spreading through Western Europe than in his actual coursework. Writing under the pen name Lulo, he attacked Albania's king in the pages of communist newspapers. It cost him his scholarship. He came home in 1936 without a degree, restless, still hunting for something larger than himself. When fascist Italy occupied Albania in 1939, Hoxha moved to the capital and opened a small tobacco shop called Flora. The shelves were stocked with the finest tobacco in town. In the dim back room, though, something else was taking shape, a meeting point for the country's underground communist cells. On November 8, 1941, the Albanian Communist Party was formally founded, and Enver Hoxha, a relative unknown, became its general secretary. Even Albania's leading historians struggle to explain how an ordinary man landed such a position. He wasn't exceptionally brilliant. He held no real sway inside the party. His presence at the founding was most likely a matter of arithmetic. Every other founder was Christian, and the party needed a Muslim face to plausibly represent a country that was, by and large, Muslim. Hoxha's rise was less about luck and more about his talent for navigating internal party factionalism with lethal precision, backed by a ruthless appetite for power. That ruthlessness would eventually make him a paranoid dictator with only one real rival for the title, half a world away: Kim Il-sung, in North Korea. When the war broke out, Hoxha headed for the mountains and built the Liberation Army from scratch. He issued execution orders the way other people ordered dinner. He'd learned to work every contradiction to his advantage. Guns from the British, military training from the Yugoslavs. While fighting the Germans, he was also running a parallel campaign, purging his own side. Any nationalist group, any rival with even a sliver of power, got shot as a traitor. Childhood friends weren't exempt. The smallest ideological drift was enough to sign a death warrant. On November 29, 1944, as the last German soldiers pulled out of Albania, Hoxha's communist forces marched triumphantly into Tirana. Here's a detail that matters more than it looks, the key, really, to understanding the madness that followed. Across most of Eastern Europe, it was the Soviet Red Army that showed up, drove the Germans out, and installed the communist governments. Albania was different. Hoxha and his partisans pushed the Nazis out entirely on their own, without Soviet troops on the ground. That victory handed him a false confidence, a delusion of invincibility that would never really leave him. He came to believe that he and his guerrilla army could stand alone against the largest powers on Earth and win. In November 1944, Hoxha was 36 years old, 6'2", fluent in several languages, and standing in stark contrast to other communist leaders in the Balkans. But the country he now controlled was a wreck. Half the population had malaria. The illiteracy rate stood at 85%, and Albania was, in practice, already under Yugoslav influence. Josip Broz Tito, Yugoslavia's powerful leader, was maneuvering to fold Albania into his federation as its seventh republic. In 1946, a treaty pegged Albania's currency, the lek, to Yugoslavia's dinar. Yugoslav advisors sat inside every ministry, inside the army itself. Hoxha played along on the surface, while privately fearing Tito was building toward his removal. His opening came in 1948, when Stalin and Tito broke with each other. Hoxha sided with Stalin instantly, threw out every Yugoslav advisor in the country, and did it publicly, with contempt. Then he moved to lock down his own power with the first of his major bloody purges. Kochi Shoce, the interior minister and his chief rival, a known Tito loyalist, was arrested, tortured, and executed. With him gone, Hoxha had no serious rival left inside the country. Hoxha didn't just admire Stalin. He dogmatically replicated the Soviet leader's internal security apparatus. Between 1947 and 1952, he made 5 pilgrimages to Moscow to study at the feet of his political idol. He built Albania's state security service, the Sigurimi, as a near-exact copy of the KGB. Records from the period suggest that 1 in every 3 Albanians was either imprisoned in a labor camp at some point under his rule or lived under the organization's constant surveillance. The Sigurimi functioned as a tool of social atomization, ensuring that trust, even within families, was a luxury no one could afford. Like Stalin, Hoxha rewrote history as he went. Faces of fallen politicians were scratched out of old photographs on his orders, as if the men had simply never existed. The climate of suspicion the Sigurimi built ran so deep that people stood ready to report their own father, their own spouse, at the first hint of disloyalty. That paranoia wasn't entirely manufactured, though. In the years after the war, British and American intelligence, MI6 and the CIA, ran an operation codenamed Valuable Fiend, dropping paratroopers and agents into Albania to try to topple Hoxha's government. Double agents, Kim Philby among them, sank the operation almost completely. But it left one lasting effect. It gave Hoxha's paranoia a foundation of real evidence. From then on, he had an excuse to crush any opposition in its earliest stage with a severity no one had seen before. Stalin's death in March 1953 hit Hoxha hard. He ordered the entire population of Tirana into the central square to kneel and swear an oath of loyalty to a dead man. When Nikita Khrushchev rose to power in Moscow and began dismantling Stalin's legacy, Hoxha felt the ground shift under him. To him, Khrushchev wasn't a reformer. He was a revisionist, a traitor to everything Marxism was supposed to stand for. Tensions boiled over in 1959. Khrushchev flew to Albania to persuade Hoxha to drop heavy industry and turn the country into the orchard of the Eastern Bloc, growing citrus and olives instead. Hoxha took it as an insult. In his memoirs, he wrote that Khrushchev was trying to turn Albania into a colony. At the 1960 Bucharest Conference of Communist Party leaders, Hoxha attacked Khrushchev in public. A tiny country of 2 million taking on the Eastern superpower, which looked, on paper, like political suicide. In 1961, the Soviets cut off all economic aid and severed diplomatic relations with Albania entirely. Hoxha now stood alone, and he knew a small country with no major backer wouldn't survive long surrounded by hostile neighbors. So he turned to the most distant ally he could find, Mao Zedong's China. It was an odd pairing, the smallest communist state in Europe and the most populous one in Asia. China supplied interest-free loans, technicians, and weapons. In exchange, Albania became China's voice at the United Nations. Back then, Beijing didn't hold a UN seat, so it was Albanian diplomats who stood up and argued its case. The alliance turned Albania into a Maoist island sitting in the middle of Europe. But Hoxha wasn't just after Chinese weapons and interest-free loans. He wanted to re-engineer Albanian society from the ground up. Until that point, Albania had lived under religion's shadow for centuries. Unlike most of Europe, the majority of Albanians were Muslim, a legacy of Ottoman rule sitting alongside Orthodox and Catholic minorities, giving the country a traditional, faith-shaped texture. Hoxha himself had grown up in a family belonging to the Bektashi order, a mystical Sufi branch of Islam. And yet, he had come to see religion not as a private matter, but as an imported poison, one that split people's loyalty between God and the party. He wanted every citizen's loyalty pointed in a single direction. In 1967, inspired by Mao's Cultural Revolution, Hoxha made the most radical decision of his rule. In a public speech, he declared that Albania would become the first atheist state on Earth. It wasn't just a policy announcement. It was a declaration of war on the country's own history and traditions. Within months, Albania saw something no other Eastern Bloc country had attempted at this scale. The government ordered all 2,169 mosques, churches, monasteries, and dervish lodges across the country closed, demolished, or converted into grain warehouses, gymnasiums, cinemas. The Catholic cathedral in Shkodër became a sports hall. Hoxha officially declared Albania the first atheist state in the world. Owning a Quran or a Bible was now a crime, punishable by prison. Even religious names for newborns were banned. Parents were required to pick from a state-approved list, tribal Illyrian names, or invented revolutionary ones. The crackdown reached far beyond religion. Hoxha was suspicious of any cultural influence, Western or Soviet. Sigurimi agents stopped men on the street for having long hair or a beard and shaved them on the spot. Listening to foreign radio or simply wearing jeans could mean years in a labor camp. Wearing a headscarf or holding a religious ceremony in secret carried a prison sentence. Sigurimi informants even questioned school children directly. Did your parents pray in front of the leader's portrait at home, or did they face Mecca? By now, Albania depended heavily on Chinese aid, and even so, Hoxha's loyalty to Mao had limits. In 1972, when U.S. President Richard Nixon flew to Beijing to thaw relations between the two countries, Hoxha was furious. He called it a great betrayal of the proletariat. Relations with China cooled steadily, and in 1978, after Mao's death and the start of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, Hoxha cut ties with Beijing too. Albania now had, on the entire planet, not a single ally left. After 34 years in power, Hoxha had finally gotten what he'd apparently been chasing all along: absolute rule over a fortress with every door bolted shut against the outside world. He told his people, "Even if we have to eat grass, we will never surrender to imperialism." While Hoxha promised his people that the pride of being Albanian mattered more than bread on the table, a very different reality was unfolding in the heart of the capital. South of central Tirana sat a district called Bloku, known simply as the Forbidden Zone. Checkpoints and armed guards ringed the neighborhood. For an ordinary citizen, stepping inside carried a death sentence. Inside Bloku, the party elite lived in villas, saw private doctors trained in the West, and shopped at special stores stocked with the finest European goods. The regime's hypocrisy reached its peak inside the party house, where top officials gathered in a private cinema to watch banned Hollywood films and drink expensive imported liquor. The same films and the same bottles that could earn an ordinary citizen 10 years in prison. Hoxha himself was no exception. He'd made private property and private cars illegal. The entire country had only 1,265 registered vehicles. Yet he rode in a bulletproof Mercedes-Benz built in West Germany. The man, so paranoid about foreign influence, hand-picked a medical team of French specialists, and his medicine cabinet was stocked with Western pharmaceuticals, care and comfort that ordinary Albanians couldn't have imagined even in a dream. Not even those high walls could keep Hoxha's paranoia out. Hoxha was convinced that Western imperialism, Soviet social imperialism, and the revisionist neighbor next door, Yugoslavia, were all racing each other to invade Albania. To meet this imaginary threat, he designed a doctrine he called total defense. At the center of this doctrine sat the bunkerization program, bunkerizimi, carried out with astonishing intensity. Military engineers designed three types. The most common, the QZ, measured about 2 meters across and was built for 1 or 2 soldiers. A larger version, the PZ, served as command posts and housed heavy weapons. The third type was something else entirely. Massive tunnels carved straight into mountainsides, meant to shelter fighter jets and submarines from a nuclear strike. The bunkerization program functioned as an economic suicide pact. Later estimates suggest that the cost of a single small bunker was equivalent to building a 2-room apartment. While people stood in line for hours just to get bread and milk, the government was pouring millions of tons of steel and concrete into these concrete mushrooms instead of roads, schools, or hospitals. Bunkers that would never see a single day of combat. But Hoxha's bunkers weren't only made of concrete. He'd built one inside the mind of every Albanian citizen, too. His secret police, the Sigurimi, had grown into one of the most impenetrable intelligence services on Earth. Their job went well beyond arresting dissidents. They'd engineered an entire system of self-censorship. Documents released after communism's collapse show the Sigarimi ran more than 200,000 active informants in a country of 2.8 million people. That meant in nearly any apartment building, any workplace, even inside a single family, there was a real chance someone was reporting back to the state. Inside that suffocating atmosphere, Hoxha showed mercy to no one, not even his most loyal men. One of the most notorious episodes in Albanian history is the death of Mehmet Shehu in December 1981. Shehu had served as prime minister and Hoxha's right hand for 27 years. He was the man who had personally carried out the bloody purges of earlier decades on Hoxha's orders. The official story was that Shehu had suffered a nervous breakdown and taken his own life. The truth ran deeper than that. Hoxha's suspicion had been triggered when Shehu's son got engaged to a young woman whose family had old ties to the former monarchy. Hoxha read it as a sign that Western intelligence had somehow reached inside his prime minister's own household. Some relatives of the young woman lived in America, and the family had, generations back, brushed up against the old royal regime. Enough, in Hoxha's eyes, to confirm Western espionage had gotten close. The night before Shehu died, Hoxha stood in a party meeting and called him a spy working simultaneously for America, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. The next morning, Shehu's body was found in his bedroom. The official word was suicide. Nobody in Tirana believed it. Within days, Shehu's wife and sons were sent to a labor camp. The message to the elite was unmistakable. Inside Hoxha's fortress, not even 3 decades of loyalty bought you safety. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, diabetes and a series of heart attacks kept Hoxha out of public view more and more. While he sat in his personal library writing thousands of pages of memoirs, Albania sank deeper into poverty and total isolation. Electricity was out across much of the country. Private cars were still banned. The only window people had onto the outside world was state radio and television, running around the clock on the triumphs of Hoxhaist socialism. On April 11, 1985, Enver Hoxha's heart stopped. He was 76. His death, after 41 years of absolute rule, left Albania in shock and confusion. The funeral itself was one of the strangest scenes in modern European history. Thousands packed into Tirana's Skanderbeg Square, wailing and sobbing in scenes that looked lifted straight out of North Korean state television. For a generation that had never known another leader, an Albania without Hoxha simply didn't compute. Ramiz Alia, Hoxha's chosen successor, took power. A loyal technocrat, he tried to keep the old system running, but what he'd inherited was a bankrupt country standing on the edge of collapse. Albania was by then the poorest country in Europe, a place where people still got around by horse cart, and even bread rationing could barely keep up with demand. Hoxha's ideology didn't die by foreign tanks, it died in the streets, from the inside. In December 1990, as the Berlin Wall fell and communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe, the wave of protest finally reached Tirana. Students at Tirana University took to the streets chanting, "We want Albania to be like the rest of Europe." The symbolic moment of collapse came on February 20th, 1991. An angry crowd in the central square tied ropes around Hoxha's 10-meter bronze statue and pulled it down. When the head snapped off the body and rolled across the ground, the fear that had gripped people for decades broke apart in an instant. They spat on the statue. They beat its bronze face with their shoes, the same face that had once been called the Father of the Nation. But when the statues fell, the concrete mushrooms didn't go anywhere. All 173,371 bunkers stayed exactly where they'd been built. Tearing them down turned out to be so expensive. The concrete and steel were built to survive a war, after all, that every government since has simply given up on the idea. Today, they're a strange, permanent fixture of the Albanian landscape. Some have become hay storage, some tiny cafes, a handful even art galleries. Most just sit there, scattered across mountains and beaches like old scars, a permanent reminder of one man's absolute paranoia. In Albania, the Hoxha file never really closes. Talk about his legacy and you run straight into two completely opposite pictures. His defenders point to the numbers. He inherited a country where 85% of the population couldn't read, they say, and left behind literacy rates close to universal. He wiped out malaria. He got electricity into the most remote mountain villages, and for the first time in its history, Albania stood economically and militarily independent. To this camp, Hoxha was a nationalist who simply refused to let his country get swallowed by the great powers around it. His critics, and the survivors of the labor camps, see the architect of a national prison. They point to the thousands who died in solitary cells or under sigurimi torture for crimes as small as listening to a foreign radio station or owning a prayer book. In their view, Hoxha sacrificed a nation's wealth and talent to his own delusions and paranoia, and held Albania back from the rest of the world's progress for decades it will never get back. Hoxha's Albania remains a case study in the ultimate end of isolationism. It forces us to ask, at what point does the pursuit of absolute national sovereignty transform into a self-constructed prison? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe to Profile for more stories from history's most controversial figures. Thank you for watching all the way through. Until next time, stay curious.